You're listening to The Social Workers on WCDB Albany.
Welcome to the Social Workers Radio Talk Show. I'm your co-host, Alyssa Lotmore. And with us today, we have Anne Grenchus, who is an LCSW. For 25 years, Anne Grenchus has blended social work and philosophy in her academic and clinical studies and work. Her 5+ years of exceptional hospice home care and bereavement counselor work has proven that phenomenological existentialism can provide a practical framework through which people living in an individualistic society can explore life challenges. Anne teaches practical workshops to hospice staff on communication and de-escalation techniques for psychiatric and dementia patients by exploring patients' lived experiences of care provision. She brings this experience to bear in her teaching, her bereavement work for the Hudson Valley Hospice, and her private practice work at Life Whispering Counseling. Welcome, Anne.
Oh, thank you. Really, it's a pleasure to be here. I feel like it's in alignment, right? It's Thanksgiving and I get to do something beautiful.
Well, your topic is about grief and understanding grief and putting meaning into what we're going through when we do grieve. And this pandemic, there's been a lot going on in the world right now. So I think this is a really appropriate topic to have you come on and talk about this understanding grief and that holistic approach. And can you talk a little bit about your work and how you got into this?
Wow. My career now is like 20 years in the making, at least, maybe 25. So I think I'll just say that my motivation for doing the CEU workshop was that I came across this book by Svend Brinkmann called Grief, the Price of Love. And it is exactly the type of bereavement work that I do in hospice. So my first master's degree is in philosophy and my second one is in social work. And I blend the two together. And Brinkmann's work on grief is very much in line with my approach. So when I found the book, I was super excited and I said to myself, everybody needs to know this, especially this year. It's so important for us to level up in our understanding of grief because we're right now in a season of grief culture-wide. So it can only help us to look at different possible ways to approach this fundamental human experience.
And is there different levels, I don't want to say different levels of grief, but we can be grieving the loss of an individual, but can we also be grieving the loss of experiences and the loss of, so many things have been canceled from, weddings, or even when somebody does pass away, you can't even have the funeral in the same way or have people over after. Is there different types of grief and how we can get through this time?
Yes, I think you put your finger right on one of the biggest difficulties of 2020, and that is that a lot of our social and cultural supports that keep us going when we are grieving have atrophied. And not only are we trying to figure out how do I live this life now without this person that I can't imagine living without, but how do I do it when I have no idea how to access those supports? Or how do I help someone who's grieving, not knowing how to reach out in a way that's safe? So there's layer upon layer of loss in general when you lose a person, but now everyone has definitely become familiar with grief, which in some ways I think is good in the sense that everybody's on the same page. We all are experiencing grief, so we all kind of know what it feels like, even though it's different forms of grief, it's different kinds of grief. And the opportunity to have those honest grief conversations, I think, is a lot more open now than maybe it would have been last year. So some people are feeling less alienated than they would have before because it's just easier to talk about because it's in popular culture, everyone's talking about it. But it takes a lot of effort, energy, creativity. So that's why that holistic approach is so important because we really got to think outside of the box these days.
And you had mentioned the upcoming workshop you're doing, and one of the reasons that I had you on today was because you are going to be doing a workshop through the UAlbany School of Social Welfare's continuing education program titled Creating Meaning Out of Grief, How to Holistically Create Answers to 15 Common, Often Unasked Grief Questions. And again, that will be on December 3rd from 1 to 4 p.m. And if anyone is interested in registering for that, you can go on the UAlbany website, www.albany.edu/SSW. But since this is a podcast and people might listen at a later date or might not be able to attend the workshop, I'd like for you to give, you just gave a really good background on why this is an important topic to, especially now, for us to understand grief more and for us to be able to have some of these conversations. But what will you be bringing in your workshop for social workers or for clinicians, or what should we understand about this grief process as we're working with clients or other individuals, even maybe colleagues who are going through these losses?
Well, I think the first thing, of course, is always to start from the heart, being heart-centered on your end. So Daniel Siegel wrote this beautiful book called The Mindful Therapist, and he really explores what that looks like to be fully present in a session and what the neurobiology of that is. So I highly recommend looking up at least his website. So on your end, you begin with the heart, because the heart is what's suffering the most in grief, and that's where you find the tension, the deepest, usually. Either that or in the gut, because people feel so scared, so uncertain. But often the heart holds a lot of tension. People might even feel like pressure there or pain there. So a literal heartache, a heartbreak. So that's what we're doing on our end, is showing up with our big, beautiful open hearts. And on the client end, we're just trying to open the door and welcome them in and meet them where they are on their path. So the way that I explain it to my clients is, I have clients all day and sometimes in the evening, and I see them driving up on their bus. They have a bus and they're in the driver's seat, and they open up the door and I come in and I sit down and we ride for an hour together and we look around at the scenery, but they get to drive the bus. And so I just say, oh, wow, look at that. Oh, that's kind of curious. That's interesting. And we see where we go. We see where we end up every single week. And then I get off that bus and I get on the next bus. So it's a really great job because it's so interesting and I never know what I'm going to see. So my advice is, in addition to that heart-centeredness, really allowing the client to lead at a time when the client isn't sure that they can. And that's why that heart-centered approach is so important, because if you can create that safe space, there's so much that can be done and accomplished through our curiosity together. And that's kind of where the phenomenology and the existentialistic approach that I take can direct us, because it's all about co-creating meaning in this very uncertain, very confusing time. So another book that I think is super helpful is Pema Chodron's I can't think of the name. Comfortable with Uncertainty. That's what it is. So Pema Chodron's Comfortable with Uncertainty. Really great, because again, it's trying to help us understand how to really create a life, live in a life, be in a life together with compassion, not knowing where we are, not knowing what we're supposed to be doing. Really, 2020, the poop has hit the fan. We don't know what we're doing. So this is a perfect time to explore our relationship to uncertainty together.
Mm-hmm. And I'm assuming as you're working with your clients, everyone's handling their own grief in a different way. There is no uniform way that one should be handling the loss of a loved one, or one should be handling, being able to, I don't want to say move on, but, continue with their life without this other person. And what is your approach for that as you're working with, you're getting on each bus every hour with another client? How do you sort of switch and meet that client where they are, since it's so different? There isn't a one way that someone deals with grief or handles grief. How do you do that, or what are some strategies?
Okay. Well, I'm not sure I have strategies at the top of my head. I can tell you that the what happened to get me to the place where I can do this, because I think everyone might have a different answer for how to cultivate that skill. My answer is that before I started working for bereavement for Hudson Valley Hospice, I had done home care hospice social work. And I did that for about 5 years. And that is a great way to learn how nothing is in control. Everyone is in crisis. And so if you can simply show up, if you can simply offer some love, if you can simply say, okay, I'm here, I see you, I see what's happening here, and I can just be a witness for just a little while with you, and we can do this together. And I have done this before, so I know some of the things that are going to happen, and I can guide you. Um, and then, of course, when you make a mistake, don't beat yourself up because there's no way to do that job perfectly. So you just say, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to do that. This is maybe what I should have done instead. And people, if you're human with them, will be human with you. And so it's not so much about people's style. Don't let the style of people coping throw you off. It's really about what you're bringing into the space. So often, um, I'm bringing that healing space right into the home just with my presence. And I think you can develop that in many ways. You know, some ways are like meditation or yoga or prayer. But what matters the most is your motivation and your respect for the client and what they're going through. So that when you show up and everything is like total chaos and you have 5 family members and they're all coping differently with the same thing and they all have these dynamics and everything is whirling and swishing and pooling, it's okay. You bring something that's grounded into the space, which is what they need more than anything else. So I just maintain my groundedness and encourage spiritual guidance as needed, so I can stay light on my feet, and I just ride the bus. It's really not complicated. You just show up. Mm-hmm. Those are a lot of beautiful words for show up, and be okay, be humble, be okay with making mistakes.
And as people move on, you know, especially during this time when there is so much loss, every time I turn on the news, you're seeing, you know, death tolls, and you know that that's an individual person and their family that are now impacted through COVID and everything. That's, you know, even, you know, suicides or everything that's happening, these ripple effects based on this pandemic. And how, when we're looking at individuals and we're seeing this loss, how is the pathway to moving on? Not, I don't want to say moving on, but to having that acceptance that this is a new reality. This is a new way of life for us, and how
on the cultural level,
or just as you're working with individuals and as you were talking with clients, and our people are trying to see this new life without this individual. How do we, or what are some strategies to help individuals that get to that point of acceptance and about finding a way to live their life with that loss now part of that life?
Okay. Well, I think before I answer that question, it's important for us to start where we're at. And as a culture, we're encouraged to move on as quickly as possible, let go. So it wasn't a surprise that you used kind of like that phrase or that terminology, because that's kind of what we're steeped in. Be practical, move forward, do what you got to do, get through this. And especially now, because it is so big, bad, and scary, there's so much of it, you kind of just want to power through it. But to thrive on the other side of grief requires finding solutions to questions we are living out, but often do not ask because we're rushing to get grief over with. And that can be a real obstacle for us. And not only are we, you know, pushing ourselves, but everyone around us in good faith. They really are looking out for us and they want us to heal and they want us to be okay, are really trying to motivate us. So if grief is so valuable, why do we want to badly get through it? And Brinkmann has a good answer for that. He explains that consumer culture expects people to be flexible and adaptable, right? We love that. And to make the most out of any situation. That's really like the American spirit, right? You put those boots on, you go, go, go. You make the most of it. Often, though, we see grief as a negative emotion, and we think that we should sidestep any needless grief. So do what you gotta do, but don't do any more than that. And we emphasize in our culture productivity and euphoria or happiness, like that's the goal, is to be happy. And it's not that I think happiness is not a goal. I think that we're here and our experience is so rich that there's more than simply happiness. There's meaning making, there's poignancy, there's mystery, there's so many other experiences as well as happiness that we're meant to have here. And I think grief does a lot for us in that regard to open those other possibilities up. But our consumer culture expects us to be flexible and positive and discourages people from getting caught up in the past. And so, we just simply don't have the same time to grieve as we have to do other things. For example, having a baby and raising the baby, you get time off for that. But finding a way to live without that person, we get 3 days. It's like doesn't really make sense, but that's the way that our culture is shaped. So, encourages us to quickly resume our social and work roles. Knowing where we're starting at, knowing why we feel this pressure to move on, knowing that we really just feel out of control because we don't have this licked yet. Starting there allows you to have some compassion for yourself when those waves of grief are rocking your boat really hard. When we lose someone we love, we are so deeply social that we might feel a part of ourselves has died along with the loved one. And, with my first significant loss, that was the first time I'd ever experienced that. And I had never heard anyone say anything like that. But now in my work, I hear people say, I died with them. I am not me anymore. I'm not the same person anymore. How do I do this? I don't know. There is no handbook for this. And the bottom has fallen out, not only because I lost someone, but I have somehow lost myself. And that's where the phenomenology and the existentialism come in. So one of my favorite philosophers' names is Maurice Merleau-Ponty, and he wrote this book that is very difficult to read, so very few people reference it, but everybody's been influenced by it. Phenomenology of perception. And in it, he says something really beautiful. He says, I really unfold in my conversations with others. When I have heart-to-hearts with others, I am talking to them in such a way that I am discovering myself while I'm talking to them. And that specific other person draws out in me something that I am discovering at the same time. So when I have a relationship to my grandfather, for example, my grandfather is a very specific grandfather. You can't Lego it. You can't take this grandfather out and put another grandfather in and boom, I'm going to be the same Anne Grenchus that I'm meant to be. No. The person, the unique style of that person is so important because it draws out in us our own style. And if we end up living in a way over time with that person that's really authentic, I got those heart-to-heart conversations where you grow and grow and grow. Oh my goodness, you become a specific person, partly in relationship to him. Now, when my grandfather dies, what happens? I no longer have that person to draw out in me that very familiar way of being a granddaughter. So what do? That's what grief work is. Grief work is about trying to figure out, okay, how do I continue to be this person that I am without the person physically being there? So how do I maintain this granddaughter that I am that's so important to me? And so it's not simply about roles, fulfilling roles, satisfying other people's needs. It's very much about the way that we co-create our reality together. And so Merleau-Ponty is very good at showing us how deeply, deeply, deeply social we are. And so when someone says to me, I died that day, I know what that means. I've felt it, but I also know what that means, why they would feel that way. And once I explain the phenomenology of grief, which Brinkmann does talk about, but Merleau-Ponty is really helpful at, they are like, oh my gosh, okay, I get it. Like it just is, it's like everything shifts, the perspective shifts, and they're like, well, okay, so what I'm feeling is acceptable, it's understandable. Now that I have words for it, I know what the task is, I know what I'm up against, I know, so now I can lick it. And then we have other things, to work on, like patience, bearing with the body's grief, that kind of thing.
No, that was a wonderful answer to my somewhat not so eloquent question that I was trying to get at, as how do we, everyone always says, move on, you need to, it's like there's a time frame, and that's not really the case, but that sometimes it feels like there is, where it's, go back to work, continue to do what you have to do. And I love how you explain that and made it, I don't want to say quote unquote normal, but you gave a name to it. You gave a reason for why people feel that way and helped people to understand that this is okay and this is a part of the grieving process.
Yeah, and I think one of the things you just said brought to mind something else that's important for us to understand about ourselves. It's not just that we live in a consumerist culture, we also live in a postmodern culture. So we have all this beautiful multiculturalism, and at the same time, we have this unprecedented freedom to create individually and uniquely what it looks like to be human. I mean, amazing, amazing, wonderful possibilities. But our society and our culture are partly needed because we need to have a wraparound approach to grief where everybody is kind of on the same page and we know we're doing it right. So scary when somebody is like, I'm grieving and I don't know how to do it, and I don't know if I'm doing it right, and I don't know when this should be over. And that's one of the most popular questions. When will this be over? They just want to know when it'll be over, right? And in other cultures, they have a timeline. They say, okay, you're going to do this, and this along this, and timeline. And we're all going to be doing this together. And when you're wearing black, we know what that means. You're not a server at a restaurant. You're grieving, right? So we know you're in this period of grief, and we're going to handle you differently, and we're going to give you support differently, and we're going to understand where you are. And we just don't have that. So although that opens up this possibility of creating grief in a way that maybe we've never seen before, at the same time, it can lead to isolation, it can lead to alienation, it can lead to loneliness, and it can lead to people really shutting out their support system because their support system doesn't know how to help without guidance, and they don't know, the bereaved don't know what they're doing. So again, that's one reason why in this day and age, bereavement counseling is so useful and so helpful, because not only can we say, okay, well, these are the tasks of grief, these are the things that you might be going through, here's some education, but then we can co-creatively explore, well, what does it mean to live myself and the bereaved forward into this unknown future?
Thank you so much. This has been an excellent segment. You discussed things that I wasn't even aware of in terms of the grieving process. And I think a lot of our listeners will appreciate that. And those who might be attending your workshop. Again, the workshop that Anne will be doing is called Creating Meaning Out of Grief, How to Holistically Create Answers to 15 Common, Often Unasked Grief Questions. And that is through the University at Albany School of Social Welfare Continuing Education Program. And it will be held on December 3rd from 1 to 4 p.m. And for those who might not be able to attend, Anne, how else can they either reach you or find out more information about a lot of what you've been discussing today?
Well, I absolutely love talking about this, if you can't tell. So anyone who's interested, I'm hoping to do some more CU workshops. Actually, when I created this one, I realized I had enough material for a level 2. So the level 2 is going to be even more exciting for me, at least because it's like about honing. The first level is about, okay, this is what is happening. Like we need to know what's really happening. And here are some ways you can, I target it towards the holidays. So I have a lot of interventions about, okay, what are we going to do? It's holiday time, one of the worst times to be alone, and we all have to social distance, right? What are we going to do? So I have some beautiful practical examples of that, like general grieving. But workshop number 2 is going to be about more specifics, like if you hate the person that died, if you feel completely alone and like nobody really understands you, those more challenging questions. And like, what if I just experienced a senseless death? How in the world am I supposed to create meaning out of that? That's what number 2 will be. So if you're interested, you can email me. I have a private practice called Life Whispering Counseling, and my email address is lifewhisperingcounseling@gmail.com. No dots, spaces, dashes, nothing. It's just Life Whispering Counseling all together @gmail.com.
Thank you so much. And when you were just talking about your second workshop that you're going to be doing, and I think this is with COVID, when we see individuals who are getting infected, and there's, the should people wear a mask? Should people not? Do people social distance? Do people not? And having, when someone's going through a loss like that, and still seeing debates about whether we're going to, how do we best prevent this? And I wonder how that plays a role in the bereavement process, or if you've even had to tackle that yet. But it's something to think about.
Yeah, I think everything. So half of what I'm bringing, of course, is that philosophical background. That's the structure of understanding. But the other half, most of the CEU workshop content is case studies or questions. That's why it's like the 15 common, often unasked questions that people bring to the counseling. So I'm starting, like I'm suggesting people do, clinicians do, starting where the client is. So instead of giving you this heady theory, blah, 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 and then saying, okay, now go figure out how to use this with people, I actually start with all of the questions. And that was one of the questions. I had this woman who, she had experienced 4 deaths, and 2 of them were senseless. And she was just like, oh my God, like her whole approach to it, her whole response to it was to shut down. So she didn't even know how to articulate the question until we explored it. But the question really was, well, like, what am I, why does anything even matter? Basically was her kind of lived response. So coping skills are lived, are answers to lived questions. So when I see someone's coping skills, I think back like a philosopher, what's the question here? What is it that they're working on here? And for her, it was really like, how do I live in this world? How do I negotiate this reality that just seems to have senseless death? And every time I invest, some senseless thing happens. How do I live like that? How do I co-create a future? How do I explore meaning? How do I live like this? That's a huge, deep, deep existential question. And a lot of us have that question right now. So that's why I ended up in the workshop.
I want to thank you so much for coming on today and sharing this information with our listeners, and also talking about the upcoming workshop in case individuals want to still register for that if they haven't already. So I want to thank you so much for coming on today. Again, we were joined by Anne Grenchus, who is an LCSW and has a blended social work and philosophy background. And I think that has helped you to be who you are today in terms of your work, and bringing that both those approaches, that philosophy and that social work blend, to bereavement counseling. And I'm very grateful you came on to share your knowledge and your expertise in this area.
Me too. And I'd like to share a poem to end, if that's okay.
I would love that.
So I don't just expect my clients to create, I also expect myself to create as part of this process. So Daniel Siegel doesn't really discuss that in his mindful therapy book, but because I'm bringing existentialism into my mindfulness and that idea of co-creation, it's not one way. I'm not giving them something and they're not just giving me something. It's co-creative. So after a session with a client, I wrote this poem, which I think is really great. It was really fun, and to write. And then when I sent it to her, she was like, oh my gosh, that's exactly it. So I think it'll help all of us face the next holiday. We just got through Thanksgiving. We got another one to go, maybe 2, maybe 3. It depends on if you count Valentine's Day. I do. I say it's 4 months of holidays to get through. Okay, so the puddle poem, the rainbow puddle poem. Wanting to see rainbows, we straddle puddles, hoping to catch their reflection. We shift our feet this way and that around the puddle. We bend our knees even further toward the reflective patch. We cock our heads just so, to be in just the right position in case the rainbow comes. Then one of us gets an idea and says, look up, my dear friends, look up, look up.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much.
You're
That was a
welcome.
really great way to end our segment. Maybe I'll have all our guests end with a poem. I think it adds a little something to the segment. But I want to thank you so much, and I'm looking forward to your workshop, and I think it will be a really great addition to our continuing education program.
Thank you.
So thank you so much for joining us today.
You're listening to The Social Workers on WCDB Albany.